Everything we have covered in this series so far has been building toward one central question. Why is it so hard to be free, to be liberated? Not free in the political sense, though that matters too. I mean, free in the most basic experiential sense, free to choose differently, free to break patterns that cause suffering, free to move beyond the same emotional loops, the same relationship dynamics, the same self limiting narratives, even when you can see them clearly, even when you understand exactly what is happening, even when you genuinely want to change. The honest answer requires holding two things simultaneously, things that most healing frameworks treat separately but which are in reality deeply connected. The first is the inner architecture of captivity, the trauma loops, the deep mind imprints, the nervous system conditioning that keeps certain patterns locked in place. We have been building a detailed map of this. The second is the outer architecture of captivity, the ways in which social, cultural, and what I would call subtle level structures actively benefit from that inner captivity remaining in place. The ways in which your unhealed wounds are, in a very real sense, a resource that certain forces depend on. Today, those two threads come together. My name is Jonathan. Welcome back to Alchemy of Remembrance. The term archon comes from Gnostic cosmology. In the Gnostic framework, the archons are a class of beings, or more precisely, a class of forces that are responsible for the maintenance of the dense material world and specifically for the maintenance of consciousness trapped within it. They are not straightforwardly evil in the simplistic sense. They are more accurately described as agents of limitation, forces that benefit from consciousness remaining bound within the narrow parameters of fear, survival, and identification with the material self. I am not asking you to take this cosmology literally. What I am asking you to do is to use it as a precise and useful map, because the Gnostic description of what archonic forces do, the mechanisms through which they operate, matches with extraordinary precision both what modern psychology describes as the mechanisms of trauma and what contemporary critical theorists describe as the mechanisms of ideological control. The inner archon is the voice of captivity that lives inside the mind. It is not your voice, but it has been so thoroughly internalized that it feels like your voice. It is the voice that says, "You are not safe. You are not enough. You do not deserve more than this. Your desires are dangerous. Your anger is unacceptable. Your authentic self is too much or too little for the world." These are not organic conclusions that a healthy consciousness reaches about itself. They are the residue of specific experiences of wounding, experiences that installed certain beliefs so deeply and so early that they became the operating system rather than one program among many. The inner archon is also the voice of compulsion, the pull toward the familiar even when the familiar hurts, the return to the pattern even after genuine resolution seems to have been achieved, the subtle engineering of situations that recreate the original wound so that the deep mind can feel at home. This internal mechanism does not require any external conspiracy to function. It is entirely self perpetuating once installed. The trauma produces the belief shapes perception, the perception selects for confirming experience, the experience reinforces the belief. The loop runs indefinitely until something interrupts it. But something does benefit from that loop running indefinitely. And that is where the outer architecture becomes relevant. I want to be precise here, because this is a territory where it is easy to slide from genuine analysis into paranoid fantasy. The distinction I am drawing is not between good people and evil ones. It is between systems and the logics that drive them. A system that depends on consumption for its survival has a structural interest in people who feel persistently inadequate. Not because the individuals running the system are consciously engineering feelings of inadequacy, but because the system selects for those dynamics, rewards, amplifies, and perpetuates them, because they are functional to its goals. Advertising does not need a conspiracy to make people feel that they are not enough without the product. The logic of advertising simply is that logic. The inadequacy is the mechanism. A political system that depends on maintaining a certain distribution of power has a structural interest in keeping the people most affected by that distribution focused on each other rather than on the distribution itself. Fear, tribal identity, and intergroup competition serve this function perfectly. Not because someone planned it, although sometimes someone did, but because the system selects for what sustains it. A media ecosystem that monetizes attention has a structural interest in maximizing emotional activation regardless of whether that activation is constructive. Outrage, fear, and tribal validation are the highest yield emotional states for engagement metrics. The architecture rewards content that produces those states. No individual conspiracy required. The logic of the system produces the outcome. This is what I mean by the outer archon, not a single identifiable enemy, a set of interlocking systems whose operational logics happen to depend on and therefore perpetuate the inner conditions of captivity that trauma produces. The mechanism through which outer systems access inner wounds is through what I call hooks, and understanding how hooks work is one of the most practically useful things you can do for your inner sovereignty. A hook is an unresolved emotional pattern that can be reliably activated from outside. It is a gap between your authentic inner center and the place where a wound still runs the show. And the more significant the wound, the larger the hook, the more easily and reliably it can be activated. The hook of inadequacy is activated by any content that compares you unfavorably to an idealized standard. The hook of tribal identity is activated by any content that defines an us and a them and implies that the them is a threat to your survival. The hook of helplessness is activated by any narrative that presents the world as overwhelmingly dangerous and unmanageable except through the guidance of some external authority. The hook of specialness, the counter movement to inadequacy, is activated by any content that tells you that you are among the enlightened few, the conscious ones, the chosen. None of these activations require your conscious consent. They happen below the threshold of deliberate choice in the nervous system, where the deep mind's conditioned responses simply fire. By the time you have consciously noticed the emotional state, you are already inside it, already providing the charge that sustains the hook. This is why intellectual understanding of these dynamics, while necessary, is not sufficient to exit them. You can know intellectually that the outrage content is engineered to activate your tribal identity and still find yourself outraged. The knowledge lives in the cortex, the hook lives in the amygdala, and in the contest between the two, the amygdala wins until the deeper work has been done. There is a concept from Tibetan Buddhist tradition that I want to use here because I think it describes something important with more precision than most Western psychological language does. The Bardo is an intermediate state, a transitional condition between death and rebirth in the traditional Buddhist cosmology. But the concept has a broader application. A Bardo state is any condition of consciousness in which clarity is not established, direction is not determined, and the individual is caught in a liminal space between what was and what could be. What I observe in many people who are intellectually aware of the matrix, who understand the dynamics we have been discussing, who are engaged in spiritual seeking and inner work, is that they can exist in a kind of permanent bardo. They are no longer fully asleep. The awareness has begun to open, but they have not moved all the way through to genuine integration and sovereignty. They exist in the uncomfortable middle, and from the perspective of the systems that benefit from their captivity, this middle state is actually quite useful. The person in the awakening Bardo generates enormous amounts of emotionally charged attention toward the very systems they are trying to understand and resist. They consume content about the matrix. They participate in communities organized around the shared identity of being awake. They feed their energy into the resistance, which, as I discussed in an earlier video, is still energetically engaged with what it is resisting. The exit is not more resistance. It is what we have been building toward this whole series: integration. The dissolving of the hooks, not through fighting them, but through removing the unresolved patterns they attach to. A person without active hooks provides no foothold, not because they are invulnerable, but because they have done the inner work that removes the gaps the outer system uses to reach them. So, what does it actually look like to move from captivity toward freedom in the practical, lived sense? I want to be concrete here. First, it looks like developing the capacity to be present with emotional intensity without being immediately swept into it. This is the core skill that all the inner work we have discussed builds toward. The person who can feel anger without becoming anger, who can feel fear without being governed by it, who can feel the activation of a hook without firing it, that person is significantly less programmable than one who cannot. Second, it looks like reducing the need for external validation as a regulator of inner state. Validation seeking is one of the primary hooks through which attention is captured and behavior is steered. The person who has enough inner stability to act from their genuine values, regardless of whether those actions are approved or applauded, that person cannot be reliably steered through approval and disapproval dynamics. Third, it looks like developing genuine discernment about what deserves your attention and your energy. The currency of the attention economy is emotional charge. The most powerful response to it is not outrage at the manipulation that generates more charge. It is genuine indifference to what does not serve. The ability to let content, narratives, and dramas that are designed to activate you simply pass through without hooking. Fourth, it looks like building a life that has its own internal coherence, a life organized around genuine values, genuine relationships, genuine creative and spiritual engagement that is internally rich enough that the manufactured stimulation of the outer systems does not feel like the most alive thing available. An integrated person is the system's nightmare, not because they are fighting it, but because they no longer need what it is selling, and they can no longer be reliably activated by what it is threatening. The outer archon is real, the inner archon is real, and they are in relationship. Each one depends on the other, but this also means that working on one affects the other. Healing the inner patterns removes the foothold for the outer ones. And this is why the inner work is never merely self-help. It is a genuinely political act. The consciousness that cannot be reliably controlled through fear, shame, and manufactured desire is a genuinely subversive presence, not because it fights, because it has remembered something the system requires it to forget. Next week, we go into the alchemy of language, how the words you speak and the words you use about yourself are rewriting your reality in real time, and how to change the program at the level of speech itself. I am Jonathan. This is Alchemy of Remembrance. I will see you in the next one. I wish you a great day ahead. Love and peace.